Well, good morning, everyone, and
Morning.
happy Halloween. And we have a guest speaker with us today, so this will all be in honor of Yorick this morning.
Good morning, Yorick.
Good morning, York.
So, for the last several weeks, we have been discussing the people that we would normally think of as the giants of the faith, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And soon we're going to begin to talk about the faith and life of Moses. And so we have been focusing on, just as the author of Hebrews has focused on, these great personalities of the Bible that are so important and so central to our understanding of the history of God's people and the revelation of God's truth through them to us. Again, from Abraham, and then we'll be talking about Moses and others. Well, it's interesting that sandwiched between the patriarchs and Moses, the next major figure, the author of Hebrews gives this interesting little call out to, I won't say forgotten or little known, but given little attention to couple, namely Moses' parents. We think, so much of how important Moses is to the story of God's people as the deliverer and the lawgiver and all of that, and that is so important. But it's interesting that the author of Hebrews gives as much screen time as he does to Jacob and Joseph and Isaac in the book of Hebrews. Moses' parents get a whole verse just like the others did. And of course, we're going to talk in detail about why that is as we discuss what their part in this story is. But even before I get into that, just the fact that the author of Hebrews calls them out and lists them in the Hall of Faith, as we've been calling it, is in itself, I think, an interesting message to us. Because so often we do concentrate in our minds about people like Abraham and Moses and David and Paul, all these great figures that we're so familiar with. But I think this one verse in Hebrews is a very important reminder that in God's plan and in God's work, sometimes the little things matter as much as the great things. Sometimes the little quote-unquote people matter as much. Sometimes God uses the humble, little recognized, little thought of moments or actions to make an enormous difference in the grand scheme of His plan. As great as Moses was in terms of what he did in terms of God's plan, in leading God's people out of bondage and of being the lawgiver, essentially teaching these people how to worship God and how to interact with God and how to know God, and then launching them in the starting of a new nation. He wouldn't have been able to do any of those things had it not been for what we're going to talk about today. And I don't mean just from the biological sense that everybody had to have parents. What the author of Hebrews calls out here is something that had they not done, we would have never had the story of Moses. And I think that's such an important point because each one of us, in our ordinary lives, we may think, okay, we're not Moses, we're not Paul. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a very important part for us to play in a way that we might not even realize. A simple act of faith or kindness that we deliver to somebody, a word we might give someone, an assistance we might give somebody, an expression of love we might give somebody, might make the difference between a wayward young man ending up in prison or ending up being a great missionary and leading thousands of people to Christ. You just never know how one of those unsung little parts that we play might make a huge difference in God's kingdom, even if we never know it, and even if it's never recognized. God is the God of the humble as much as He is the God of the great. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to remember how important that can be. How important our little piece is, even if we might think we're not important, or think we don't matter, or think what we do doesn't matter. It really does. Even if it's just one little thing that might make a difference in somebody else's life. We don't know what the domino effect of that's going to be in God's greater plan. And in the case of Moses' parents, I'm sure all they were thinking about was saving their child. But what a difference that made in the world. And you can't overestimate that. And I think that's part of the lesson in this, not just what they did, but the fact that God led the author of Hebrews to record this in His eternal word as an example of faith, just as important as He did for Joseph and Jacob and Isaac. I mean, He gave them as much space in the Hebrews as they did. That means that in this particular story, it's just as important. So, with all that in mind, we're going to look at the situation as we find it in the beginning of Exodus. As you know, we left in our last session, the end of the book of Genesis. We were talking, we saw last that God's people, the descendants of Jacob, they were still living in Egypt at that particular point under the care and everything of the king of Egypt, or the Pharaoh of Egypt at that time. And so that's where the beginning of Exodus chapter 1 starts us out in that same situation. However, as is always the case, as you see in verse 6 of Exodus 1, now Joseph and all his brothers and all of that generation died. So what we see here is the passing of basically an entire generation, and the change that gradually occurs in God's people in terms of their environment and their surrounding over time. Because as we left them at the end of Genesis, as you remember, Joseph was basically the prime minister, you might say, of Egypt, and he was beloved by that Pharaoh, and his and the people of God, the family of Abraham's descendants living there were under the protection and the care, basically, of Joseph and Egypt, and they had their own place to live. But as is always true, time passes. Joseph died. All that generation died. And this change, of course, as this progression of time happens, made a great change in how God's people were going to be treated by their patrons originally. And at the time that they were living there, the Bible says that the family numbered somewhere in the range of 70 or so. That's a pretty big family reunion, but that's still not that many people. However, what we see in the very next verse, the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly. So we see here God fulfilling His promise, fulfilling the very first promise, really, of the covenant, that God would make of Abraham a great nation, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands of the seashores. And so that began to happen, and they began to multiply exponentially and grow from a family group of around 70 to what would eventually become hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions eventually. All this was the fulfillment of God's promise that they would be a great nation. However, over time, one of the other things that changed, of course, was the leadership in Egypt. Because as the generations rolled by, new pharaohs came along. He uses the term pharaoh and king interchangeably in this chapter. So when I say king and pharaoh, I'm talking about the same office because he uses it interchangeably. But over time, as the generations go by, not only are there all these descendants of Jacob that are multiplying, but also there's different pharaohs who are ruling over Egypt. And as the generations roll by and time roll by, that positive relationship, that tolerant relationship between the Hebrews and the king was forgotten and fallen into the past, no longer remembered. And the time came when a new king came along, this one in particular, verse 8, then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. So this was the second great element of change that happened. Not only the passing of those generations of Joseph and his descendants, not only the great multiplication of the population, but also now this new king that comes along. And he did not know Joseph. It had passed into memory. And this king did not understand or know anything about that special relationship that the old pharaohs had with Abraham's descendants. And so he looked at this enormously growing population of outsiders, of Hebrews, and instead of seeing a people that he wanted to protect, he saw a threat. And he began to get concerned about this. He says, look, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. He came to the point where he was no doubt afraid that they could no longer control this population. And moreover, there was this fear. They had this particular land that they had been given to live in called Goshen. And there was the worry, the concern that he had that if they were to go to war against, if Egypt were to go to war against some of their enemies, that maybe the Hebrews would rise up and ally with their enemies instead of them. And that Egypt might even fall because of this. So what he says, what he decides to do, verse 10, come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. That word shrewdly, it essentially means to be wise. So he decides that he needs to come up with some kind of a wise or smart plan to deal with this growing population. So what does he decide to do? Verse 11, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And so at this point they felt like the best way to not have to worry about this population rising up against them while they still had the power to control them, they would put them into slavery. And so this begins this centuries-long brutal slavery because of a fearful king who saw the Israelites as a threat, and even more so than their external enemies. And it says that they made their lives bitter with hard labor. And this word bitter, it implies that the situation that they found themselves in was much more than just the aspect of physical labor. That it implies as much of an emotional burden and emotional pain and spiritual pain as even a physical one. I mean, here we had a group of people, a population who'd been more or less content and well cared for, had a place to live, a home, And they had been considered welcome there. And then practically overnight, now they're put into this brutal slavery. And so it was an emotional bitterness as much as it was a physical burden. And it says the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. And it's an interesting word. The Hebrew word there, the root actually means to break apart or fracture. So when I read this, this implies to me literally a broken people. Not just under physical labor and no longer having their freedom, which is bad enough, already having this emotional bitterness, but it implies this aspect of just their spirits being broken. And it implies the severity and the cruelty that the Egyptian slave masters had upon them. Slavery in itself is bad enough, but they were harsh and cruel and severe with them. And again, this just implies now a people that have become practically overnight bitter and broken. But as if that was not enough, we see this paranoid Pharaoh deciding that he needs to even limit their further growth as a population. Because even in slavery, they continued to, reproduce and grow exponentially. And so maybe he was afraid that they would get to the point where they couldn't even control them, that the population would grow so big. So he decides to limit the Hebrew population. And he tries this 2 different times in 2 different ways. He starts it by simply instructing the Hebrew midwives who attend the births of the Hebrew children. And he says, if the baby that's born is a boy, kill it. But if it's a girl, let it live. Well, the scripture says these midwives, they were afraid, they feared God. They were afraid that if they did this, no doubt they would be punished for murdering these babies. And so they tricked the Pharaoh, they lied to the Pharaoh, and they said, oh, these Hebrew women, these babies come out before we can even get to them. They're strong. They don't waste time. And so the babies are born before we can even get to them. So sorry we couldn't do it. And somehow the Pharaoh buys this. I don't know, that seems like a kind of a lame lie to me, but he buys it. God rewarded these midwives, though, for protecting the children by themselves being blessed with children as a reward for what they did. But the Pharaoh doesn't give up. And in the last verse of Exodus chapter 1, we see the Pharaoh giving this order to all his people. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And so I read this, of course, and I can't help but think how this is also a picture of what, for different reasons, happens with Jesus. When he is born and they seek to kill Jesus as well, and he's also protected by being hidden away in Egypt of all places. It's almost as if from the beginning Moses' life in some ways presages what would happen with Jesus, because they attempt to kill him as well. So that leads us, and of course that wasn't directed specifically at Moses, just at the Hebrew children, but that leads us into Exodus chapter 2, and we are introduced to the actions of Moses' parents in the first 4 verses of Exodus chapter 2. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman. Now we're not given their names here, and the author of Hebrews doesn't give us their names either, but I think that it is significant here. It makes a difference if they tell us that these are both from the tribe of Levi. And that becomes very important, because of course that means their children are of the tribe of Levi. And as you know, Moses' brother Aaron becomes the first high priest. And from that point on, the tribe of Levi becomes the tribe of the priesthood. That's why it's referred to as the Levitical priesthood. And in fact, when all the different tribes, when they come into the land eventually, all the different tribes are given territories that belong to them for their tribe. The Levites do not get a specific place because they are in charge of the tabernacle and leading the worship of by God's people. And that is why they are told, the people are told to offer offerings to the Levites because they don't have a way to support themselves because their lives are devoted to being priests. And that's why the rest of the people are supposed to take care of the Levites. So all of that derives from the fact originally that this particular couple are from the tribe of Levi. And all of the priesthood ends up coming out of the Levi tribe. So she becomes pregnant in verse 2 and gives birth to a son. Now, of course, ordinarily this would be a moment of great happiness and joy to have a baby. And of course, from the cultural standpoint, as we talked about before, they're always more happy about having a male child than a female child because in a patriarchal society, that means that, that going to grow up to be a man will be the patriarch of the family and so forth. So normally the birth of a boy would be a joyous time, but not here. Because under this edict from the Pharaoh, the birth of a boy means tragedy. The birth of a boy means death. The birth of a boy means a murder is about to happen. Certain death for her newborn baby. So the verse goes on to say, when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. The word fine there, it's a basic word that just means good in the broadest sense, and it can be used to describe many qualities depending on the context. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about how it's described in the verse in Hebrews. But for now, I will just simply say that it generally was used in this context to mean beautiful or handsome or striking in appearance in some way. Obviously, Moses' mother saw something in this child that was somehow unique and different. I don't know if it's a comment on how normally Hebrew babies are kind of homely or plain looking. I don't know. Personally, I think all babies kind of look the same when they're first born, all kind of red and puffy and squinty-eyed and everything. So I don't know. But obviously this baby looked somehow different. And from the context both here and also where this is mentioned in Acts chapter 7 in the sermon of Stephen, and then of course in the Hebrews passage, I'm speculating somewhat here and reading a little bit between the lines, but I sense that God gives them the impression that there is something important and special about this child. Not just his physical appearance, but something is different about this child. She was convinced that he had to be protected and managed to hide him for a period of time. Now, no doubt, of course, maternal instinct was part of this. Of course, it was her child. She was going to want to protect him. But it specifically says there was something about the countenance of this child that impressed her that she needed to protect him, that went probably beyond the normal maternal instinct. This is why I suspect that there was some impression that God gave her, that she needed to protect this child. So for 3 months, she managed to hide him. This in itself was not only an act of bravery, as we'll talk about more when we talk about the Hebrews passage, because clearly if the king had ordered this and she defied him, hiding the child from the soldiers, that in itself was probably an act worthy of death or imprisonment just for defying the king. But it was also had to be a very difficult thing to do. Imagine trying to hide a crying newborn baby, not only from soldiers, but probably from nosy neighbors who might have turned her in to be in good with the guards. There's always going to be people like that. It's interesting when I was reading this, I don't think that this movie is actually an allegory of this at all, but I can't help but think of it. Have you guys ever seen the movie A Quiet Place? Okay. Well, it's a science fiction movie that came out a couple of years ago, and it's about an alien invasion. But what these creatures are is they can't see, but they have extremely strong hearing. I mean, to the point where they can hear whispers, and that's how they hunt. They're more animalistic. They're not really intelligent, and they hunt by hearing because they're blind. And they're also very vicious, and they just rip people apart when they catch them. They're like animals, like I said. Well, the movie focuses on a surviving family. It's a mother and a father and a teenage girl and a teenage boy, but the mother is pregnant. And at one point in the movie, she is giving birth when one of those creatures is in the house. And imagine trying to give birth silently, because the whole point of the movie, and the reason they call it A Quiet Place, they have to do everything silent. The whole movie, they can't talk, they can't make noise, because any noise will bring the creatures. So they have to be quiet. So just imagine giving birth to a baby while trying to be quiet, because any sound that is made means certain death for you and the baby. And then after the baby is born, because she is able to do it, but after the baby is born, they construct a soundproof box to put the baby in, and they can actually, when the creatures are near, they can actually close the baby inside this box, and they have a little oxygen canister with a mask on it, so that they can close it up in this box to keep it quiet or to block the sound when the creatures are near. But then there's one particular point, and it's been a while since I saw the movie, so I don't remember why it happens, but the basement of their house where they're hiding gets flooded out, and there's actually a scene of this baby in this basket floating in the water while the creatures are looking for it, and it's inside this. I just can't help but feel like it just seems like an allegory of this. I don't know. Nothing else in the movie points to that. I always wonder if they'll ever do a sequel where this baby grows up and somehow will lead the people to victory or something over this. Then it really would be an allegory of Moses. But anyway, that's what I think about when I think about this particular aspect of the story. But anyway, so for 3 months she has to hide the baby. But at some point it gets to the point where she can't. So in verse 3 we see, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch, and then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So she did a very cunning thing. And this in itself shows a lot of faith and trust. Because what she does is she basically places her baby's fate in the hands of a stranger. Letting him go, basically. And so she places his fate in the hands of this young woman. It doesn't say it in so many words in the text. And again, here's a little Chuck speculation. But I suspect that this Pharaoh's daughter who comes down to the river to bathe, she's seen her do this before. I don't think that was a complete coincidence. I think she knew that this Pharaoh's daughter did this frequently, and that she strategically released that basket into the river at a place where she knew that this girl would find it. Because she also sent the older girl, the sister, in verse 4, his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And so I get the impression that they were expecting that the basket would be found by someone. And that's why I believe that they expected that that young woman, the Pharaoh's daughter, would find it. But she couldn't possibly know what would exactly happen. And then I love that verse 4. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. And it was almost like, okay, to see what would happen with Moses. This is like the opening to like the rest of Moses' life, thinking of what would happen. Well, this baby is going to end up growing up and delivering the people. That's what would happen. I think that was quite a statement there. The making of a nation. So the next verse, the Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. And I think this is something she did all the time. I think that her appearance was something that probably could be counted on. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. And she opened it and saw the baby. Now here we have again God's providence at work. She sees the baby. She sees that it is one of the Hebrew babies. She recognizes it as one of the Hebrew babies. Being the Pharaoh's daughter, knowing the Pharaoh's order, she very well could have gotten one of the soldiers and said, throw this baby in the river. This is one of the Hebrew babies. She could have done it herself. She could have rejected him. She could have killed him herself. Knowing she was the Pharaoh's daughter, she probably should have from a legal standpoint. She took a risk herself. But for some reason, she did not. Now, the verse here tells us the baby was crying and she felt sorry for him. Her maternal instinct kicked in. The evidence was at this point she was childless. But instead of having hatred for him as one of these dreaded Hebrew children, she had compassion for him. I believe God intervened in her heart at this moment and changed what she really, as an Egyptian woman, should have done in obeying her father's command. And so she took a great risk in rescuing this baby. And so God intervened in a very miraculous way. And this is where we see, I think, the faith of Moses' mother in trusting that God would take care of that baby once she released him into the Nile. Because even though I think she suspected something like this would happen, she was certainly going for some kind of a miraculous occurrence. She couldn't possibly know actually what was going to happen. She only knew that she had to save her baby. So, it's interesting. This is another reason that I think that this had happened before, the Pharaoh's daughter coming down to bathe. Because verse 7, we see that his sister, Moses' sister, comes up to the Pharaoh's daughter and offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. And the Pharaoh's daughter doesn't seem to be surprised to see her there. Like, what are you doing here? Who are you? Why are you here? I think maybe they had seen each other before, maybe in the past. So she wasn't surprised to see her there. And so when the sister offers to find a Hebrew mother to nurse the baby, she says, yes, by all means, go. And of course she goes and gets Moses' mother. She's a smart girl. She goes and gets Moses' mother. And so Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So it's just incredible how God works this situation. Mm-hmm. That not only is Moses rescued, but Moses' mother isn't even separated from him for very long. She gets to be with him and nurse him and care for him. And she gets paid for it on top of everything else. And she gets to see Moses saved and grows up in the Pharaoh's household and eventually, as we know, becomes Prince of Egypt. The child grew older. She took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And this, of course, was God's plan all along, to take this humble son of a Hebrew slave and turn him into a prince of Egypt. Much like Joseph had been, but for a different reason. But in this case, instead of rescuing his people from a famine, Moses is going to rescue his people from slavery. And then she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. It's actually the literal meaning of Moses' name. The Hebrew word Moshe means literally to draw or pull out, or to rescue. So Moses' rescue by being drawn out of the water is a picture of the way that God will later rescue his people by drawing them out of the water also, namely the Red Sea. I just think I don't know if that's deliberate, but to me it's like a picture of parallel. Moses was rescued out of the water, and so will God's people be rescued out of the water. So that's what happened. And now we go to Hebrews and see what the author of Hebrews has to say about this. In Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. So as I mentioned before, this first great act of faith required great courage. Because not only, as I said before, was the baby himself at risk, but they were at risk for doing this. Had they been caught hiding the baby, they would have been at the very least imprisoned, but probably executed. Probably run through with a sword by the Egyptian soldiers if they had found it. And so they showed great bravery. Because, the author of Hebrews says, they saw he was no ordinary child. And so I wanted to spend just a little time talking about this. I mentioned before, the word in the Hebrew word, which meant good or fair or beautiful. Here, the author of Hebrews uses this Greek word, which the root is from the word that means a city. And it came to mean someone who is urbane, or elegant, or polished, or handsome. It was always used in this as sort of contrasting with someone who was like a rustic farmer, or shepherd, or somebody that was not particularly, well-pleasing to look at because they were rustic and outdoorsy and rough looking. It was a word that was used to describe someone who was elegant and sophisticated. And so this is the way that once again, this baby was described. So what does that actually mean? It is hard to say, other than clearly there was something about him that looked noble and different. There was an air of nobility about this child that was just different from an ordinary screaming baby. That they knew that God had a place for this child, that he was something special. That beyond the maternal instinct of, I want to protect my child, this child was special. And that's again why I'm reading between the lines and believing that God gave them some kind of vision, some kind of knowledge. They were meant to save this child. That he was important. Like I said, there was a nobility, an importance about him. And they were willing to risk their lives to save his. Just as he would later risk his life to rescue the rest of God's people. So he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So here we see their courage. The king's commandment no doubt included that threat of death or punishment for disobeying, and they held no fear or terror for that. They saw the importance of God's plan for this child's life as more important than their lives. When it says they don't fear the king's edict, I don't think it meant that they didn't have emotional fear about what might happen, but they put the importance of God's plan over their fear. I've often heard it said that courage doesn't actually mean not being afraid, it just means being willing to step in despite your fear. And I think that's what they mean by this. Being willing to take that risk despite what they might have emotionally felt inside, as far as being afraid of what might happen to them. God's plan was more important to them. It was worth more than their own lives. But they were clearly moved by God in a remarkable way to preserve the life of this child for much greater purposes. And so, because of this one act of courage and one act of faith, even though they're not named, they are given that prominence in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews. As important in God's plan as Jacob and Joseph and Isaac were, as far as the amount of words that they're given. Because without them, there would have been no story of Moses or a story of the deliverer. And so by faith, Moses' parents